single moment the other stared at him, unspeaking, a haggard, unshaven figure, utterly different from the trim little scientist Rowan remembered. And then he came across the room, hands outstretched. "Rowan!" he cried hoarsely. "Good God, you here, Rowan!" Then his thoughts shifted, lightning-like. "They've gone out, Rowan?" he asked. "These things, these creatures, they've started their attack!" "Yes," said the assistant, "over Brinton hours ago. I came when you disappeared there in the swamp." Swiftly he spoke of the attack on Brinton, of his own crazed flight into the swamp, his own trip down the shaft and capture, and when he had finished, Morton was silent, his face a mask. When at last he spoke, it was in a whisper. "They've started," he whispered, "over Brinton, and over all Earth now, and I who might have warned, captured." "You were captured by them there in the swamp?" asked Rowan, quickly, and the other inclined his head. "Taken there by them without a chance to escape, and taken down here. You know, Rowan, why I came to Brinton, to the swamp, to investigate the rumors we had heard of great bones and skeletons existing in the slime of that swamp. And in the week I spent investigating the morass, I found that the rumors had spoken truly. For here and there inside the edges of the morass I found great bone fragments, which could only come from dinosaur skeletons. Then, a week after I had begun my search, the thing happened. I was working with my probing rod, perhaps a mile inside the swamp, when there was a sudden distant crashing of trees, and I saw a gigantic slate-colored bulk rolling across the forest toward me. Before I could recover from my amazement, the thing was on me, a great brontosaur ridden by one of the lizard men, a gigantic dinosaur out of the Mesozoic age, crashing through an Illinois swamp. Before I could gather my stunned wits, another had crashed toward me from beyond it, and in an instant I was the prisoner of the lizard creatures who fettered my hands and feet, crashed back on the great brontosaurs with me toward that mound at the swamp's center, where they yawned the opening of the great shaft. Up and down that shaft moves the great disc platform endlessly, and on it they brought me down to this cavern world, down to this gray city of theirs, and into this building. And here first I was examined by 3 of their number who seemed to hold positions of authority among them. For hours the 3 examined me, striving to converse with me in their rasping tones, endeavoring to make plain to me the elementary word sounds of their strange language. That language, I found, is a phonetic one, but aided by gestures and written diagrams, we were able to attain to a rough exchange of ideas. And partly through their own questions, partly through what I had seen in the great cavern outside, I came to understand who and what these enigmatic creatures were, and where they had originated. They were beings of an age dead for hundreds of millions of years, I learnt, creatures of the Mesozoic age, that period of the Earth's history which we call the age of reptiles. For in that age the races of mammals had hardly begun to arise, and the great and smaller reptiles and lizard races were the rulers of all Earth. And just as man, the creature of dominant intelligence, was to develop later from the races of mammals, so had these lizard men the dominant intelligence of their own age developed from the races of reptiles. They had spread out in great numbers over what is now North America, the most habitable portion of Earth during the Mesozoic age. They had built strange cities, had developed their knowledge and science in myriad ways, and had learned how to conquer and subjugate the great reptilian creatures who swarmed then on Earth to make servants of them. The great brontosaurs, more tractable than the rest, they used as mounts and beasts of burden. The fiercer tyrannosaurs and allosaurs were their beasts of war, and on the mighty pterodactyls they soared into the upper air and flitted across Earth's surface. Great indeed was their power, and through that power and through their terrible giant servants, they ruled all the habitable parts of Earth unquestioningly. At last, though, there came that great convulsion of Earth, which was to mark the end of the Mesozoic age. That vast world cataclysm in which continents sank beneath the seas and new lands rose from the ocean's depths. In such convulsions and mighty quakes, the cities of the lizard men were shaken down and annihilated, and across all their world was wild confusion. They knew then that they must find some other place of refuge or perish, and so they hit upon the plan of descending to one of the great cavernous spaces which lie scores of miles down in Earth's interior. They had discovered long before that such great caverns exist inside Earth's crust, and so they pierced a shaft down to one of them and descended into it to investigate. They found it a place large enough to hold all their numbers, and one quite habitable. It was lit perpetually with crimson light too, since the molten fires of Earth's heart had pressed up close to the walls of the cavern, and through an opening in those walls there poured down eternally a raging Niagara of molten rock and flame, that titanic fall of living fire whose blazing radiance illuminates all this cavern world. So beneath this fall of fire the lizard men constructed a canal which conducted it into a great stone basin which lay directly beneath the opening of their shaft in the cavern's roof. And from this basin the molten fires were able to seep gradually into crevices beneath the cavern. Naturally, however, an intensely powerful gale of heated air roared up from this molten lake, and by setting a ring of current projectors around the lake, they were able to concentrate the cyclonic power of those winds into a single concentrated air current, roaring straight up and through the shaft, and capable of lifting titanic weights up that shaft. Just as a cyclone, which is concentrated wind, will lift and whirl about great buildings. And this terrific upward thrusting current they used to lift their great disc platform up the shaft, arranging the projectors beneath so that the force of the current automatically lessened when the disc reached the top, and allowed it to sink again to the cavern's floor, to the fiery lake, whence it traveled up again, and so on ceaselessly, an automatic, never-stopping lift or platform on which the throngs of the lizard people and their dinosaur beasts were able to move down into this cavern world. Only a portion of their dinosaur servants did they bring with them, leaving the rest to perish above, whose bones indeed I had found in the swamp. When this had been done, they closed tightly the opening of the great shaft above and dismantled the great ascending and descending disc for which they no longer had need. Then their horde set to work to build up their cities anew in their new cavern home. Far above them, the surface of Earth writhed and twisted gigantically, annihilating all the hordes of dinosaurs above, but the cavern world of the lizard men remained unchanged, as they had foreseen, and in it they lived serenely on. When at last the surface of Earth quieted once more, they could have quitted their underworld and gone back up, but they did not do so, since by then their city was established in the safe, warm world of the mighty cavern, and they had no desire to leave it. So in that cavern they lived on, while on the world above the races of mammals rose to replace the great reptiles, until with the passing of ages, man rose to dominance over all those races, and set his cities where those of the lizard men had once stood. The mouth of the shaft was hidden and covered by the great swamp, and on all earth none suspected the races who dwelt beneath them. So ages passed, and might have continued so to pass until the end of time had not necessity pressed once more upon the lizard people in their cavern world. As I have said, the interior fires of Earth's heart had pressed up close against the walls of their cavern, bursting forth in one place in that fall of flame which lighted their world. And now the molten fires began to press with more and more force against the walls, forced up by convulsions far beneath, and it was only a question of time until they would burst through those walls and sweep over all the cavern world in a great cataclysm of annihilating fire, instantly wiping out all life in the cavern. They must leave it, they knew, before that happened, so they decided to venture back once more to Earth's surface. So they again placed the great disc platform in position, and as it again swept ceaselessly up and down, a party of them rose on it and opened the mouth of the shaft in the swamp far above. It was that party exploring the swamp on their great brontosaurs who had captured me and brought me down here to examine me. They had observed that intelligent creatures, men, now were established on Earth's surface, that one of their cities stood near the swamp itself, and so they planned to send up first a striking force which would annihilate that city, annihilate Brinton, to prevent any possible interference from it. Then that first attacking force would return down the shaft, leaving guards at its mouth, and all the lizard people and their dinosaur hordes would gather and assemble to pour up the shaft on the great disk and sweep out upon Earth to conquer and annihilate the world we know. Besides their dinosaurs, they had their own heat beam projectors, those white globes in which they could condense and concentrate heat vibrations, holding those vibrations static and releasing them at will in a concentrated ray. So they poured up the shaft to attack Brinton, and now that that attack has been made, their first striking force will return down here, gathering together all their hordes for the last attack on Earth itself. Within hours, I think, that attack will take place. Their hordes will swarm up the shaft and out over Earth. Up at the shaft's mouth, they have placed a great switch, which will be turned on when all of them have left this cavern and are safely above, and which will release concentrated rays down here that will blast the cavern's walls and allow the floods of fire that press against them to burst into the cavern. For they fear that if they do not do so, the imprisoned fires will burst forth in some mighty cataclysm that will wreck all Earth. To loose the fires upon the cavern while they are in it would be to annihilate themselves, of course, but if it is done through the switch above after all of them have gained Earth's surface, there will be no harm to themselves. So all their plan has been carried out so far, and within hours now their hordes will be sweeping up the shaft and out over Earth. And what then? What will the forces of man avail him? What troops could stand against the thundering, gigantic dinosaurs? What guns against the deadly heat beams? What airplanes could ever battle with the hordes of circling, swooping pterodactyls and the rays of their lizard riders? For man, and for the world of man, there looms swift annihilation only, when the hordes of the lizard men and their giant beasts sweep terribly upon him. Morton's voice ceased, and he sat motionless, staring across the dusky little room with strange eyes. From the great corridor outside came the rasping voices of passing lizard men and the thundering tramp now and then of one of the great dinosaurs, but in the room itself was silence, as the two men regarded each other. Finally, with an effort, Rowan spoke. "And so they plan to sweep out over all Earth," he repeated. "Plan to annihilate the world we know? And no chance of escape for us. No chance to get back up to Earth's surface." Morton raised his head, a sudden eagerness on his face. "There is still a chance," he said. "If we could get out of here, could get to that disk and back up the shaft, and we must soon. For soon I know their hordes will be sweeping up that shaft, and when all are gone they will loose from above the fires upon this cavern, annihilating us unless we are slain by them before. Soon I think they will come to take you for questioning also, since had they not intended to do so, they would have slain you outright. And when they come, here is my plan." Swiftly he unfolded his scheme to Rowan, and wild as it seemed, the other agreed to try it as their only chance. Then they sat silent for a time in the darkness. It was a silence and a darkness torturing to Rowan. On Earth above he knew the news of the terrible attack on Brinton would be flashing out, would be spreading terror and panic over all the world, and soon now would come the outward, resistless sweep of the lizard men and their dinosaur hordes from this cavern world, unless they escaped. Hours fled by as they sat there, while from outside came the unceasing hurrying of lizard men and dinosaurs through the giant corridor. Then from the distance came a loud bellowing and chorus of rasping cries, and a thunder of many gigantic feet passing the building where they lay imprisoned. "The first attackers," whispered Morton. "They've come back from Brinton. They'll be assembling now beyond the city there, making ready for all to go." Outside in the corridor the sounds had lessened, almost ceased. It would be sunset by then in the world above, Rowan thought, and he wondered momentarily whether the desperate scheme which he and Morton had agreed on was to be of no avail. Then, as though in answer to his thoughts, there came a sound of footsteps down the great hall outside and a fumbling with the bolts. Instantly, the two were on their feet, and at once they put into action their plan. Leaping toward each other, they locked instantly in battle, gripping and striking at each other furiously, swaying about the room, smiting and kicking. Rowan glimpsed the door slide down and open, saw two of the lizard men entering with white globes held toward them, but he paid no attention to them, nor did Morton. The two men staggering about the room as though locked in a death combat, twisting and swaying in assumed fury. There was a rasping command from the lizard men, but they heeded it not, still intent upon getting at each other's throat. Another command was given, which they ignored also. And then that which they had hoped for happened. Since the foremost of the lizard men came toward them, gripping Rowan's arm with a taloned claw and pulling him back from Morton, and as he did so, Rowan turned instantly, and before he could raise the deadly white globe, had leapt upon him. As he leapt, he saw Morton springing upon the other of the two creatures. Then all else vanished as he whirled blindly about the little room with the reptilian creature in his grasp. He held in his left hand the claw which gripped the white globe, preventing the creature from raising it, but as they spun dizzily about, he felt his own strength beaten down by the lizard man, since the power of the muscles under its scaled hide was tremendous. With a last effort, he clung to the creature, to the claw that held the globe, and then heard a cry from Morton, saw the other of the two scaled shapes hurl his friend to the room's floor, and leap toward the door. The next moment, his own hold was torn loose as his opponent wrenched free and leapt and turned toward the door with his fellow. A single moment, Rowan glimpsed them as he staggered back, and then he became aware of something round in his hand, the white globe which his frantic grip had torn from his opponent's grasp. With a last instinctive action, he raised it and threw it at the two at the door. It struck the wall beside them, the white globe seeming to smash under the impact. Then there was a great flash of pallid light there, a gust of intensely heated air, scorched over Rowan, and then the two lizard things lay upon the floor as two charred, shapeless heaps. The smashing of the globe and the release of its condensed heat vibrations had annihilated them. Instantly, Morton was on his feet, and the two were staggering out of the room into the immense dusky corridor outside. Down it they ran for a moment, then suddenly stopped, for from ahead had come the sound of immense steps, while some vast black bulk had suddenly blotted out the great square of crimson light at the corridor's open end ahead. Then, as it came on, they saw the great thing clearly, a gigantic brontosaur that had halted momentarily 100 feet down the corridor from them. A moment it surveyed them with small, glaring reptilian eyes, then raised its mighty neck and head with a vast hoarse bellow and thundered straight down upon them. As the colossal beast charged down upon them, Rowan stood motionless, stunned, seeing as though in some nightmare dream the great snaky neck and head, the gigantic trampling feet, and hearing in his ears the deep bellow of the oncoming monster. Then suddenly Morton had leapt forward beside him, uttering a high, harsh-voiced cry, a cry at which the thundering brontosaur suddenly slowed, stopped. A scant 20 feet from them it stood, regarding them suspiciously, and Morton turned swiftly to the other. "Come on, Rowan," he cried. "I heard the lizard men direct these beasts with that cry. I think it'll hold this one till we get past." Together they ran forward down the corridor toward the gigantic brontosaur, which was regarding them with its small eyes in seeming perplexity, its head swaying to and fro on its sinuous neck as they neared it. Now they were to the great beast, pressing past it and between its great body and the corridor wall, its mighty bulk looming above them awe-inspiringly in the great corridor. As they ran past it, the huge beast half turned, half stepped toward them, but as Morton repeated his strange high cry, it halted again. The next moment, Rowan breathed for the first time in seconds, for they were past the brontosaur and racing on down the corridor toward its open end. As they neared that end, they slowed their pace, crept forward more cautiously, until they were peering out into the great crimson-lit street. The broad avenue seemed quite deserted and empty, and they sprang out into it toward the central plaza, where lay the lake of fire in its ascending and descending disk. But suddenly Morton turned, pointed back. Far down the street behind them, a great mass of huge figures was moving toward them, a mob of mighty dinosaurs and lizard riders, which was coming rapidly up the avenue. "They're coming now!" cried Morton. "They've gathered, they're ready, they're going to go up the shaft! Now!" From the advancing horde they heard now deep, gigantic bellowings, answered far across the great gray city by others like it, by other masses of dinosaurs and lizard men moving toward the central plaza and the great lake of flame. Then abruptly the two men had turned and were racing madly up the avenue toward that lake, up the broad and empty street toward the great disc that was their sole hope of escape. On and on they staggered until at last they were stumbling between the last gray buildings of the street and into the broad, clear plaza toward the rim of its central basin of fire. Rowan looked up as they ran, saw high above them a dark, expanding circle which was dropping down from a round black opening in the rock roof far above, dropping swiftly down toward the lake of fire ahead. And then he cried out, for emerging into the empty plaza directly across from them were a half-dozen of the lizard men, who saw the two running men and, uttering rasping cries, sprang around the rim of the flaming lake toward them. The mighty disc was sweeping smoothly downward now, down until it hung level with the plaza above the basin's fires. And now Morton had flung forward across the 2-foot gap and upon the disc. But as Rowan too leapt forward, the racing lizard men reached him, and as he threw himself upon the disc, which was rising now, one of them had leapt forward with him and pulled him back. He clung frantically to the great disc's edge, and then the mighty platform was rising smoothly upward while he and his lizard man opponent clung dizzily to its edge, swinging above the flaming lake and striking at each other with their free hands. Rowan felt himself carried upward with ever-increasing speed, heard the roar of winds in his ears, and glimpsed the raging lake of fire below, and then felt his strength slipping from him beneath the blows of the lizard man, who clung to the disc with one taloned claw and struck out with the other. Then, as Rowan felt his grip on the disc's edge slipping, loosening, there was a flashing blow from above, which sent the scaled green body of his opponent whirling down into the flames beneath, torn loose from his hold. And as Rowan's nerveless fingers released his own hold, a hand above caught his wrist. There was a tense moment of straining effort, and then he had been pulled up onto the disc's surface by Morton, and lay there panting. A moment he lay thus, then crept with Morton to the disc's edge, and stared down with him at the gray city which now lay far below. They saw pouring into the plaza a great mass of huge dinosaurs and a vast throng of the lizard shapes, an eddying throng that was moving now toward the plaza and the fiery lake from all the city's wide and branching streets. The next moment all this was blotted from sight, as the disc shot smoothly upward into the darkness of the great shaft, flashing up that shaft amid a thundering of confined winds. Over the raging of those winds, Rowan shouted in the other's ear. "They've gathered down there," he cried. "When the disc goes down again, they'll come up with it, after us. We have only minutes." Morton shouted back, "The switch! If we could open that wheel switch up there! Let loose those fires below!" Rowan gasped. The switch! That switch which the lizard men had themselves prepared to use after they had all come up from their cavern world. If they could open it, could release upon that cavern world the raging fires which pressed against its walls, it would mean annihilation for the lizard people and all their giant reptile hordes. If they could... Abruptly, he grasped the other's arm, pointed mutely upward. Far above them, a spark of pale white light was glimmering, a spark that changed to a spot, and then to a little circle of pallid light, as their disc platform flashed up toward it with tremendous speed. And now, as that circle of white light widened, the disc was beginning to slow its speed a little. The downward flashing metal walls beside them were moving past them more slowly. Up the great disc lifted, while the two men crouched tensely at its edge. And then it had floated up until it hung level with the mouth of the great shaft beneath the radiance of the suspended bulb. It was night once more on Earth, Rowan knew, but the brilliance of the white bulb overhead was dazzlingly revealing as the disc swept up to hang at the shaft's mouth. In the moment that it hung there, both he and Morton threw themselves from it onto the surface of the mound, And then as the great disc sank downward once more into the shaft, they saw that their movement had not been observed, since the only figures on the mound were a half-dozen of the lizard men, armed with the white heat-beam globes, who lounged near the great three-pillar switchboard at the opposite edge of the mound from the two men. They had not turned as the great disc reached the shaft's mouth and sank again, and after a moment of crouching, Morton whispered to Rowan, who crept slowly off the mound in obedience to that whisper and into the shelter of the dark bordering forest around it. There he began to slip through the trees stealthily, while on the mound itself he saw Morton crawling snake-like around the great shaft's edge toward the switchboard. Minutes passed while the two crept on from different sides, minutes that seemed eternities to Rowan. And then he had reached the edge of the mound near the switchboard and was gathering himself for a dash toward it. And in that moment, he was discovered. There was a harsh cry from one of the lizard men guards at the mechanism, and instantly two of them had leapt toward him across the mound. Rowan sprang to his feet, but before he could gain the surface of the mound, he was borne down by the charging of the two scaled shapes, thrust back into the swamp from the mound's edge, and struggling in their grip. He heard another cry, glimpsed the other guards on the mound springing toward Morton, who had half risen. Then all other sounds in his ears, the rasping cries of his opponents, the deafening winds from the great pit, the panting of his own breathing as he whirled about. All these sounds were suddenly dwarfed by a sound that came to his ears like the thunder of doom. A deep, throaty bellowing coming faintly as though from far beneath, but growing swiftly louder. Nearer, coming up the shaft from the ascending disc there. "Morton!" he cried. "Morton!" Then he saw Morton whirl sidewise from the guards who ran toward him, saw him leap toward the great switchboard and toward the wheel switch at its center, felt himself thrust backward as his two opponents rushed back onto the mound with frantic cries. At the same moment, the giant disc swept up again to the shaft's mouth, hanging there crowded with masked lizard men and a half-dozen of the huge tyrannosaurs. Out toward Morton leapt these gleaming-fanged monsters, and from a score of the lizard men on the disc and on the mound there stabbed toward him rays of pallid light. But in the second before those deadly rays could be released, Morton had grasped the great wheel, had spun it around in one frantic motion. The next moment, the machine and Morton beside it had vanished in a flare of blinding flame, but even as they did so, there came from far beneath a gigantic rumbling and crashing, a rending crash as of riven worlds, while the ground beneath Rowan swayed and rocked violently. The next moment there had burst up the shaft a vast gush of crimson fire, a molten flood bursting up from the suddenly released seas of molten fires below, annihilating the great disc that hovered in the shaft, raining in fiery death upon all on the mound, falling hissingly into the water and slime about Rowan. Then there was another rumbling crash, and the mound itself seemed to buckle, collapse, as the walls of the great shaft below it collapsed. And then before Rowan there lay only a vast smoking gouge in the earth, with no sign of life in it. For minutes Rowan stared, unable to credit the miracle which had taken place before his eyes, which had thrust back the lizard men and all their dinosaur hordes at the last moment, annihilating them in their cavern world far below by the switch they had themselves prepared, by the molten fiery seas of Earth's heart which Morton's hand had loosed upon them. But for all the incredulous emotion within him, he could find no words, could but stretch out his hands speechlessly toward the steaming pit before him. And then he suddenly became aware that he was weeping. It was hours later that Rowan stumbled at last out of the great swamp and westward across the rolling fields toward Brinton. Behind him, the first pale light of dawn was welling up beneath the horizon, and as he went on, the fields about him lay misty and ghost-like beneath that increasing light. Then, as he came wearily to the crest of a little rise of ground, he paused, gazing ahead. Before him lay in the distance the ruins of Brinton, a great mass of blackened wreckage in which was no sign of movement and from which arose no sound of life. So silent was it, so wrapped round with the unutterable stillness and soundlessness of death, that it seemed to Rowan, standing there, that he must needs be the last living creature in the world, the last living man. Yet it was not so, he knew. Out beyond the shattered city, out in those other cities beyond the horizon, out over all Earth's surface, there would be running men. The fleeing of panic-driven crowds and all the fear and horror which the invaders from the abyss had loosed upon the world. But soon would come an end to that. Soon those fear-driven throngs would be drifting back, returning, would be learning how those dark invaders had been thrust back, annihilated, the destiny of their race shattered by a single man. Soon. Rowan looked on at the silent ruined town, his lips moving. "You alone, Morton," he was whispering. "You alone." Then, as he stood there, the pallid light about him changed, deepened, while from behind him there shot forth long rays of yellow light. Beneath the magic of their alchemy, the whole world seemed transfigured suddenly from gray to glowing gold. But Rowan never turned, never moved, standing still, motionless there on the crest, gazing westward, a black, lone little figure against the splendor of the rising sun.
And thus concludes our exhibit on the Abysmal Invaders by Mr. Edmond Hamilton. This has been both one of my more technically ambitious projects, as well as one of the more troubled productions I've ever had, what with the channel being burnt to the ground and all. But we're back, we're talking about dinosaurs, and I want to thank, as always, all of the museum's generous Patreon supporters, particularly Michael Fattori and Break System BSE, for their ongoing support. It's good to have you all here. And thank you all for being you.